Welcome back, everyone. Our next panel, moderated by Cayman Somerville from Greentown Labs, will be engaging in an important conversation on environmental justice and equity, which are central to sustainable development. Cayman?
Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning into today's exciting panel discussion. My name is Cayman Somerville, and I am the Chief of Staff at Greentown Labs, which is the largest climate tech incubator in North America. And just a quick note on Greentown, we are a community of nearly 130 early stage companies tackling challenges across the largest greenhouse gas emitting sectors like electricity, buildings, transportation. And at Greentown, we define climate tech and sustainability as mitigating the impacts of climate change while building the resilience of communities and infrastructure. So that's why I'm very excited for today's conversation. And just another note, where Greentown Labs is located in Somerville, just outside of Boston. We have a 100,000 square foot campus that provides entrepreneurs access with office and community space. And next week, we are actually planning to open our second location in Houston, Texas. So please reach out if you're interested in learning more about Greentown Labs. But focusing on the topic of today, I'm so honored to moderate an exciting discussion on sustainability and equity. And this is a topic I'm deeply passionate about. And so we have some excellent panelists today, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear from them. And thank you so much to Todd and Emmy and the AI LA team for organizing today's Earth Summit and for just really ensuring that the important topic of environmental justice and equity is being addressed today. As many of us know, the United Nations has reported that we have less than 10 years to act in order to prevent the very worst impacts of climate change on people and the planet. And if we don't limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the risks of catastrophic weather events, droughts, poverty are significantly worse for hundreds of millions of people, particularly underserved populations who did not contribute to this crisis. So the urgent action that was needed to address this crisis must be inclusive of the voices of those who are being most impacted. And so that's where environmental justice comes in. Environmental justice is really acknowledging that climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. So these inequities really need to be addressed head on. And that's why it's so important to hear kind of what the panelists have to say today and learn a little bit about these mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we have three incredible climate champions. I'm just going to briefly introduce them to you all, and then we'll have them introduce themselves as well. Today we have Dr. Jenny Lentz, who is a program manager at the Coalition for Clean Air, where she manages a statewide air quality monitoring network in California and works with the community to increase the awareness of the connection between air quality and health. We are also joined by Arnav Mariwala, who is a climate tech entrepreneur and co-founder of HighTide Intelligence, which is a climate risk company focused on mapping and predicting climate impacts in coastal communities. And I'm honored to have met Arnav through the inaugural On Deck Climate Tech cohort, which is currently taking place. And then finally, we have Dr. Shannon Gibson with us today. Dr. Gibson is an associate professor at the University of Southern California, Dornsife, and she teaches courses on global environmental politics, globalization, global public health, non-state actors, and social movements. So let's jump in with some additional introductions. I'm really curious to hear from the panelists about their backgrounds and kind of how where they came really influences the work they are doing today. So Shannon, let's start with you. How did you end up in the sustainability and equity sector?
It's been a year of this and I still start talking when I'm muted, right? Okay. Thank you so much for having me. So I actually didn't start my graduate career focusing on climate change. I actually started focusing on global public health, specifically looking at the political and economic implications of infectious disease spread and natural disasters. And it only took me a year of that graduate work to understand that it was become clearer and clearer that these issues, these public health issues, were inextricably linked with climate change, and that they were being exacerbated by climate change. And so when I went back for my PhD, I decided to focus on climate change as part of my dissertation. And I thought that I would go and do sort of a very international relations kind of wonky state-based analysis of why states decide to act on climate change and why when they don't. And it was through attending World Social Forums and then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COPs, which we have the COP26 coming up later this year, that I began to have this very intense focus on non-state actors and social movements. And I was introduced to the climate justice movement. And within a couple of years, I became not only a researcher of this topic, but a scholar activist. So I work not just to kind of chronicle what's going on in these talks, but working alongside environmental and climate justice organizations to champion this framework within the talks and within the negotiations. And so that's kind of what brought me here. And again, I'm excited to be here. And so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shannon. Arnav, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Cayman. So I grew up in Mumbai in India, and as I'm sure most of you guys know, it's a coastal city which experiences a heavy monsoon every year. And as I was growing up, I noticed that there was just a lot more flooding every year than before. And a large reason for that was rapid urbanization that destroyed a lot of natural flood mitigation resources we had, like mangroves and rivers and so on. And chronic flooding just became a part of life in Mumbai, and that kind of stayed in my mind, along with my experiences being a sailor and a hiker. I spent a lot of time sailing along the west coast of India, saw beaches eroding, as I grew up. And similarly in the Himalayas, when you're hiking over there, you can see glaciers receding. So that was something that was imprinted in me from a very early age. And about 7 years ago, I moved to the Bay Area to attend Stanford, where I studied physics and history and eventually studied geophysics. While I was studying physics, I realized that I wanted to apply my background more to problems that would have the most impact on people. And I realized very quickly that climate change was going to rapidly change the face of the planet and how we interact with it. And I also found the dynamics governing natural systems incredibly fascinating. If there's any physics nerds in the crowd, I'm one of those masochists who really likes fluid mechanics. So that's kind of what brought me in. But while I was in grad school at Stanford, I started studying coastal resilience through my research group. It's called the Sigma Group. And specifically, we were studying the two projects that kind of looked at this topic, right? One was studying how natural ecosystems could be effective coastal defenses against hurricanes, storm surges, tsunamis, that kind of thing. And the other was figuring out how to predict the socioeconomic impacts of sea level rise in the Bay Area. That latter project eventually turned into HighTide. A couple of colleagues from my research group and I co-founded the company a year and a half ago. And we decided that we could start scaling the work we were doing within our research group across the US, and really figure out a way to make coastal cities most resilient, because they are in some sense at the front lines of the whole movement around climate resilience. And so right now, HighTide works on mapping and predicting climate impacts, mainly in California and Florida. And a big part of what we do is engage with local governments and local NGOs, other community stakeholders. Because one thing we realized very quickly was that, and this is something I noticed growing up as well, is that flooding impacts the most vulnerable sections of society disproportionately. Part of it is because land prone to flooding is cheap, and if you're part of a vulnerable section of society, that's where you might end up living. And part of it is just because we've just seen such a rapid change in both climate conditions and urbanization around the world that you are going to see a lot of vulnerable people just be exposed to flooding in general. So yeah, that's broadly my story, and happy to share more.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Arnav. Jenny, over to you.
So I kind of have a similar story to the rest of the panelists. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, where my entire life we experienced climate change, and it's only gotten worse. Extreme heat events were a constant part of growing up there. We were always dealing with severe droughts, severe wildfires. So from almost infancy, it was a part of the conversation. And then watching how things changed very rapidly, and things that I'd learned in high school that we should start to expect to see 20, 30 years started happening 5, 10 years later. Arizona now has, they always had dust devils, but now we have these giant dust storms that are unlike anything that had ever happened before. And everything is happening at a much more rapid pace than had been anticipated. So it was always front of mind for me. I ended up going to college in back in the Northeast and studied environmental science there, and then went on to get a PhD. And my PhD focused on GIS and spatial analysis and trying to better understand the spatial nature of diseases. But a key thing that I kept focusing on throughout my PhD was climate change had been something that I had thought about, talked about, learned about my entire life, and it wasn't getting better. Everything was getting worse. And it seemed like it became more and more clear to me that the actions that were being taken seemed to be sending us in the wrong direction. And so by the time I finished my PhD, it was very important to me to continue work, but change the focus from framing everything about with doom and gloom messages that while the changes are absolutely happening and they're terrifying, a lot of the focusing on the doom and gloom messaging just brings about, just from a psychological perspective, it shuts people down, it makes them feel guilty, it depresses them, and you can only hear so much of it before you just stop. And for me, that just kind of explained why in 30 years, while everything is exponentially happening at faster and faster paces, more and more people were disbelieving it and turning it off. And I think a large part of that is the psychological of how it was being framed. So a lot of my work now is focused on really focusing on localized impacts for people. So oftentimes you think about polar bears way off in the distance, losing ice, but that's not something that people really, it's depressing, but you don't personally relate to it. So focusing on local in time, local in space impacts, but then framing it with solutions so that people can start to really feel empowered and thinking about, I'm not resigned to this, and I don't have to live in a world where this is going to get worse. What type of community do I want to live in? And a lot of the mitigation strategies also make more resilient, healthier communities. So trying to really get at what people are experiencing and how they're experiencing it, and then empowering them to envision a better, more resilient, healthier world that can also mitigate and deal and even thrive through the changes we're experiencing. So trying to really focus on those positive messages that excite, empower, and want people feel the need to act afterwards. So that's kind of my story.
Awesome. Thank you. And, I feel like I really resonated with aspects of all three of your guys' stories. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts on some of the questions that we have coming up. But the first question I would like us to jump into is around understanding the current opportunities and challenges with closing equity gaps. So how can we help people see these opportunities, the opportunities with closing these gaps, and what are these opportunities and challenges? Shannon or Arnav, would one of you guys like to start?
Sure, I can start over here and talk a little bit more generally about what the opportunities are like, and then kind of look at how do we actually make use of them, or take advantage of those opportunities. So I think the important thing to reiterate is that any efforts to close socioeconomic equity gaps when it comes to environmental justice is a net benefit on an entire community and the entirety of society. It's not just a targeted benefit towards a certain population. And the reason for that, there's two reasons for that, right? The first one is that whenever you have a natural disaster, I'm talking more from the perspective of responding to a really extreme event, like whether it's a hurricane like Hurricane Harvey, or one of the wildfires we've seen in California for the last 3 years or so. Essentially, the repair and relocation costs for most people is really steep, and some of it tends to be borne by government, but what we learned while researching this first at Stanford and then at HighTide was that there's a lot of economically vulnerable populations that end up being pushed into poverty because the cost of rebuilding and relocating uses up all of the discretionary income, even after you account for payments from FEMA or similar agencies. And of course, most economically vulnerable groups in the US do tend to disproportionately be people of color among other demographic groups. So it definitely has like a disparate impact. What that means for the entire entire community or entire like metro area or region is that in the aftermath of a disaster, you're basically going to see a huge amount of people have reduced spending power and also be pushed into poverty. And as a result, you're going to see the vibrancy of the entire region and the resilience of the entire region drop. It's very hard to rebuild an entire city if your population can't rebuild their lives first. So any investment you make in resilient infrastructure that is targeted towards the vulnerable communities does tend to impact the entire region and does tend to have co-benefits for everybody else over there as well. And that's as simple as investing in a piece of public infrastructure, like for flooding, there would be like a levee, or investing in restored marshland. Usually interventions like that end up protecting public spaces, end up protecting commercial property, end up protecting large swaths of residential property as well. And so those are kind of like examples of where there's a ton of co-benefits there. Beyond that, if you're trying to be an entrepreneur in the space, and make impact and build a sustainable business while having impact, there's a ton of things you can do and a ton of opportunities to create just better products that can drive resilience, right? So one example is more accessible insurance products that can get to people who traditionally would not buy flood insurance or wildfire insurance, but also don't end up extorting them. But at the end of the day, what those products like that provide is a certain amount of security against being pushed out of your home and not being able to pay the bills after that. So it's kind of like a very broad overview. Happy to dive into any one of those aspects.
Then I could chime in a little bit as well. I think one thing that we've seen mentioned in the news quite a bit is the way in which dealing with climate change in the American context is now being coupled with the COVID recovery, right? And I think that a lot of people immediately think like, oh, good, we're going to deal with both of them in one fell swoop and we're good. And one thing I would want to let the audience know is that, I think it is great that the Biden administration is including issues relating to renewable energy and this green transition in the recovery bill. But the devil's always in the details. And so one of the things that the climate justice in the United States is particularly interested in is then looking at how that is implemented. So there are very key concerns about how is just transition defined and then implemented. How is renewable energy even defined? Because that's an incredibly broad term that can often include a lot of energy solutions from a justice perspective that have a lot of negative externalities associated with them. There's also questions about who owns these projects and the infrastructure that's created, who gets the money, who gets the bids, and those sorts of things. And so I think a lot of times in the case of after a disaster, we want to transition very quickly to the opportunity to rebuild. But I think, again, coming from a public health background, we have this huge cautionary tale of looking at Hurricane Katrina and this whole idea that we could go in and rebuild New Orleans and the surrounding areas in this much better way. And if you look at that area today, because so much of that effort was privatized and it wasn't inclusive and it didn't include impacted communities, we still see those same disparities that exist decades later. So while I think the Biden administration is doing some good things here, one thing that if you want to get into, the details and weeds of it, that would be something very important going forward to kind of follow and see exactly how it's being implemented and to make sure that justice is at the center of that framework.
And just to expand on what Shannon was saying, I was living in Louisiana during Katrina, and even the resources that were made available, the people that needed those resources did not have access to it. Everybody I knew that got money from FEMA were privileged people that were very lightly impacted, because a lot of the groups that lost everything didn't have access to internet. They would have had no clue where to go to seek out those resources. I knew several families that you were able to get money from FEMA, but it was supposed to be used exclusively for housing. Well, in order for them to pay bills, they had to get to and from their job, and their car was destroyed during Katrina. So they used that money to buy a car that they then lived out of so that she could still maintain her job, still keep her kids in school, and FEMA pulled the money. So there's a whole nother thing of, you really need to be thinking about how to get the resources to communities that need it, and not have people with higher education, more privilege, more access to tools, manipulating the system to get the bulk of the funds and not having it go towards the people that really need it. And even citizenship falls into this as well. I mean, things like, I'm dealing with organizations right now that are saying their community members aren't getting the COVID-19 vaccine because they aren't allowed to get vaccines in general because they aren't citizens. And they're dealing with the additional impact of they're being given eviction notices because they don't have social security numbers. And so there's all kinds of other impacts that people are dealing with. And so when you come in and talk about, we need more renewable energy, we need more of this, thinking about the communities that are dealing with the most extreme heat, we need to be thinking about, they're not owning these buildings. They're not going to be applying for solar panels. They don't have access to that. So finding ways to get the landlords to do that, finding ways to increase the insulation on the buildings so that the most rundown buildings can be more weatherproof and not need as much air conditioning, finding ways to improve. Atlanta had a great program where they specifically put solar in disadvantaged communities. And as part of that, they upgraded the homes that people were renting so that they could handle the solar panels, so that the roofs weren't leaking, that the buildings were weatherized. A lot of this needs to be added into it because the places at most risk, if everybody's renters and often multiple families are living in the same household that aren't even related, it's very difficult to try and implement a lot of the solutions that you see being advertised, because they wouldn't have the power to implement any of that. So that's really thinking about how to make it accessible to these groups and how to reframe it so that they can use it.
So that kind of leads me to think a little bit more about kind of these localized environmental justice issues in communities. And like when I think about environmental justice, I think about air pollution around communities who live around airports, for example, but they're very localized. And so how do we raise awareness about these environmental issues when they're so diverse?
Partnering with community groups in those areas and being the fly on the wall where they're leading the conversations with their community members and finding out what's affecting them. I'm dealing with various community groups right now. Some are most concerned about airports, others are more concerned about trucks. And it's in talking to them that you find out where the trucks are really going that they're not supposed to be going. They're not going necessarily on the trucking routes, they're going through neighborhoods. And if you were to just send an outside group to do air quality monitoring, they wouldn't know which streets the trucks are violating. And there's so many more impacts beyond air quality. It's the safety that people feel when these giant semis are going down residential streets. Even if you were to switch them to electric, that safety concern is still there, just surely by the size. The vibration of heavy vehicles going down these streets, keeping people up at all hours of night. The lights going through their buildings so that they can't sleep. It's all of these other things that's compounded on top of air quality that you wouldn't know unless you're talking to people and hearing how their mental, emotional, and physical health are all being impacted by these. So and oftentimes it takes partnering with the local group and training them on how to facilitate conversations, because you also need that local trust. And sending a person like me into these communities, they are not going to feel comfortable opening up and sharing everything that they are being impacted with. But I could be in the back of the room and never introduced and have a well-known person in their community that they trust guiding them through these conversations. And that would be a much more impactful way to really get at the heart of what people are experiencing, how they're experiencing it, so that you can then have a better idea of those impacts and then include them in the process of trying to address them.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate what Jenny just said about that, because that's something we realized very early on with our work in HighTide as well. So we partnered with a nonprofit in East Palo Alto, which even though it's just adjacent to Palo Alto, home of billion-dollar companies, is still is still a very socioeconomically disadvantaged area. At one point, it was the murder capital of the U.S., and it faces chronic flooding, every year right now. One thing we realized very quickly, and I think this is very relevant for anybody trying to build a product to address some of the specific issues within climate justice as a whole, is that you really do need to do co-creation, because if you don't do that, if you don't engage with community leaders, you don't engage with maybe even local government, you just aren't going to create a product that anybody is going to use, right? And it could be something as simple as making sure that your product's in multiple languages. So when we were building a prototype that would just show which neighborhoods within East Palo Alto were most widely affected, we realized very early on that a large percentage of the residents over here who we wanted to get this information to, would tend to use mobiles instead of computers. So we needed to make sure from the beginning that we were mobile native. And the second thing was that a lot of them were native Spanish speakers or native Tagalog speakers or other languages, right? And so we realized that we couldn't just try to default to having information about sea level rise impacts in just in English, right? Like the language part was something that was not as intuitive to us, but we had to build for. And I'd say taking a step back, it's taking a bit of a step back from there. I think a lot of stakeholders within larger communities, whether that's business owners or just like people working in local government, might not will understand the scale of the inequities, but won't necessarily understand the scale of the inequity as it pertains to climate impacts or natural disasters. And so, like, actually being able to visually show how how badly exposed certain populations are is kind of something that is an ongoing process that we are trying to work on as a startup, and that more generally a lot of other players in this space like First Street Foundation are doing to show how disasters like flooding and wildfires will impact vulnerable populations more than others.
And then I could add on a little bit. Because I do so much research on social movements, we talk a lot about framing as a tactic that organizations use. And I think one thing that's helpful in considering environmental justice is to understand that it's not just about the environment, that environmental justice is racial justice, it's gender justice, it's labor justice. So for maybe not stakeholders or people who aren't as engaged in what's going on with the climate and the environment, a clear way for me to explain this to students and others is that if you support Black Lives Matter, you inevitably care about environmental and climate justice, because guess who, unfortunately, is more likely to live near an incinerator, a polluting, emitting plant, a freeway, who's more likely to have higher asthma, cancer, chronic illness rates in the United States? It's communities of color. And I think you can then make the same connection for women, for children, the elderly, immigrants, refugees, the LGBTQIA plus community, right? So that this marginalization and vulnerability is not just specific to the climate or the environment, it's wrapped up in all of these social issues that have really exploded to the kind of common consciousness in 2020. And so I think thinking about it maybe sometimes broader than just the environment or climate is also a way to help pull people into this conversation.
Awesome. And I want to switch gears a little bit because we're moving quickly through time. Shannon, earlier you mentioned President Biden's climate action plan, which despite its limitations is considered to be the most comprehensive US plan on climate to date. And I would imagine it's the first to integrate aspects of equity at the federal level. But next week, President Biden will be hosting the Leaders Summit on Climate as part of the first U.S. Climate Action Week. So 40 world leaders committed to goals in the Paris Agreement will be virtually attending. What is the implication of this summit? What does it mean globally, nationally, even locally?
So I think this, in the context of the United Nations climate change negotiations, is going to be a big deal. It's very similar to when we originally signed the Paris Agreement before we unfortunately left it. That was under the Obama administration, and there was a joint statement with China. And what we saw then was that once the United States and China signed on to the Paris Agreement, there was a windfall of other developed countries that then signed on to that agreement. Fortunately, even though we left, those countries stayed in. But what we're preparing for right now is COP26. So this will be the 26th year that we're negotiating climate change at the global UN level. And it's supposed to be the 5-year anniversary, but technically it's the 6th because we had to skip a year due to COVID. But at this big meeting, the expectation is that countries are to ramp up their climate commitments. They made commitments back in 2015. They've had 5 years to see how they've done. And now the idea is that they're going to ratchet up their mitigation and adaptation and funding commitments. And as of right now, last I checked, I think only about 50 of our 192 countries have submit those commitments. And so the expectation is that by bringing these 40 leaders together and the US signaling taking a leadership role again, hopefully, like we saw before, we'll see another windfall of countries submitting what are called their nationally determined contributions. And hopefully that can get us back on track. Because as of right now, despite so many countries being a party to the Paris Agreement, we are nowhere near meeting the goal, the threshold that they have designated of a 2 degrees increase over pre-industrial levels, of maintaining that. We are far above it. So hopefully this will kind of give a bit of, light a fire under the collective tushes of the countries to get back onto the Paris Agreement and to kind of move forward, and also to consider how, again, COVID and climate change are being discussed similarly in these talks.
Jenny or Arnav, do you guys have want to contribute to this question?
I think Shannon touched on a lot of what I would have said.
Awesome. Well, that's okay, because the next question is kind of a big one. We know, and we've touched on this a lot throughout this, but want to get more in the weeds. We know we need to dramatically ramp up the development and deployment of solutions that are going to prepare people, communities, and infrastructure for climate change. But what are these affirmative solutions or technology innovations that we need to make to address climate justice and shape these policies?
Yeah, so I'm going to say something that might get me canceled in Silicon Valley, but honestly, we have a lot of the technology that we need to start solving these problems, right? The question is always around deployment and making sure it gets to the right people. So, one big bottleneck for governments basically comes under, identifying areas that are going to be badly affected preemptively, and then being able to identify which areas are actually affected in the aftermath of a disaster. And then finally, it's about how do you deploy resources there rapidly. And I think a really, really awesome trend over here is the fact that you've been able to collect so much more high resolution data from satellite or remote sensing that you can, start creating much more. You can start creating much more detailed maps of wildfires or floods or predictive models for other kinds of disasters, and then apply that same tech to air quality, etc. And what that enables you to do is that it enables you to start doing targeted interventions in communities which are exposed to natural disasters or other kinds of adverse environmental impacts. And so I think, like, coming from a software background, I'm a little bit more biased towards that. There's also obviously a ton of work being done more on the built environment side, right? So building resilient housing, for example, is something that is becoming policy and kind of becoming the norm because of market demand in parts of Florida, for example. And all of that, I think, is a good trend. But fundamentally, just being able to figure out preemptively where these kinds of disasters are going to hit, being able to start allocating resources there, in advance of a disaster, and then having some kind of early warning system are basically all advancements that are being worked on in both the public and private sectors. So other startups in the space, like One Concern, for example, have been working on tools to that can enable government to determine which areas are going to be affected, in almost in real time. On the flip side, there's another problem which we would really need to solve. I think this was touched on earlier in the panel as well, which is how do we get money or resources to people who are affected by these kinds of disasters, as quickly as possible, right? I don't know if anybody has ever had to file a flood insurance claim, but I've heard it's not very pleasant. And it's a really long process, and it does take a while for the payout to come to you if you have a policy there. And so there's companies that are innovating on the business model side using new technology through IoT and better ways of underwriting to create new ways of insuring people who otherwise would frankly not be able to get insurance, and doing so in a way that isn't exploitative either. One company that's doing good work over here is a company called Flood Flash. So I think just putting it together, I mean, we need to find a way to utilize a lot more of the data we have on the built environment, on better weather and climate predictions, and through that being able to really identify which areas are going to be most effective, and then start looking at interventions over there. And the interventions can, on the government side, can be something like changing building codes to ensure that there's they're built to be more resilient. So buildings are built with a little bit more of an offset or a higher first floor elevation. Maybe they're built with floodwater runoff, or they're built with large green spaces that can absorb floodwater. Maybe they're built with maybe there's certain kinds of landscaping that's mandated that can prevent wildfire spread, just as an example. And then from there, once you're able to identify those areas, it comes down to, okay, how can you actually create the materials, create the ways of financing solar projects, etc., that can really get vulnerable communities to have this kind of infrastructure.
Focus more on a lot of historical nature-based solutions that worked in the past and would work now, but we seem to have lost it. And even groups that want to switch to them can't because of the way regulations are set up. So things like regenerative agriculture saves tons of water. You're much less resistant to a lot of the climate change. Farms that are practicing regenerative agriculture produce many more crops, so they're not worried about having one crop that then fails. They are able to plant them around each other so that they benefit off each other. They actually create much healthier soil that sequesters substantially more carbon. And if just 5% of the world transferred from traditional agriculture to regenerative, we could actually reduce CO2 to 350, which is huge. Not to mention that you're doing this in a way using techniques that were used hundreds of years ago, and it's more resilient. But so many farmers, even when they see this, they don't do it because in order to do that, they would have to give up the government subsidies, which as it is, they are barely making it on that alone, but they are forced into a system of growing the same crops, using the same technology. And the handful of people that were brave enough to leave it are profiting and thriving from doing this. So we need federal action to keep people from forced into systems that continue to exacerbate the problem, but people feel trapped in those systems. Same with water. In California, it'd be fabulous if we had water markets where right now farmers are given a certain amount of water, and if they don't use that, they lose it. And so even if they wanted to put in more efficient watering systems and do drought tolerant systems, they then run the risk of, if they didn't use their quota, they won't have access to it. But we could put in a water market system that incentivizes farmers so that they still have the same access to their water, but if they have extra water, they could sell it to the cities that need the water and then use that profit to continue to come up with more resilient ways of growing their crops. So a large part of it also needs to come from the government in preventing systems that aren't working and allowing people the flexibility to switch towards systems that can be much more resilient to climate change, while also making it more profitable for people as well. And a lot of that's older knowledge.
Yeah, on the topic of nature-based solutions, one thing I want to add is that there is work being done both in the public and private sector, on nature-based solutions for resilience along with carbon sequestration. New York City, for example, has invested heavily in an Oyster Reef restoration program, which is going to have immense benefits for protecting the coastline from storm surges, like what happened during Superstorm Sandy. And large parts of the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, are studying how to build coral reef nurseries and looking at coral reef restoration and using that as a means of protecting coastlines from storm surges that come from hurricanes. And advances in techniques for coral reef restoration, most notably a technique called microfragmentation, really does accelerate the timeline through which you can actually restore a reef to its pre-hurricane state. And one heartening movement that we're seeing over there is that we're starting to see private sector money go into reef restoration and kind of see it as not just as a CSR project or something like that, but as an actual investment, as something that will help their bottom line going forward. So that's just another innovation on the nature-based solutions front, and we're starting to see some of that for salt marshes, mangroves, and other critical coastal ecosystems.
Shannon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that this same discussion happens at the global level. So there's a macro discussion about access to technology that's permeating the talks that are coming up, because when you look at who are the creators of a lot of green technology, it is the global north. And then the owners of those intellectual property rights are, again, corporations largely housed in the global north. And so within the Paris Agreement, there is a technology transfer mechanism, and the rules of that and the framework and the funding is something that's going to be hashed out this year in Glasgow at the talks in November, because there is an acknowledgement of this sort of conundrum that you have a number of developing countries and emerging economies who desperately want to make this transition, right? They're being told you need to develop, provide electricity, water, up your GDP, but you can't go through the Industrial Revolution like we did. Right. And so there is this acknowledgement that there needs to be a discussion about how to maybe loosen patent rights. That'll have to be done in conjunction with the World Trade Organization as well. But just to let people know that that is a discussion that's happening at the macro or the global level, also acknowledging that there are disparities in access to technology, even within country or between countries, not just within them.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And just want to let the audience know that in a few minutes, we're going to start taking some audience question and answers. So this is your reminder to put in some questions. And in the meantime, we're going to ask kind of the last prepared question to these panelists. And feel free to jump in, whoever would like to start or take this one. But how can the audience engage? How would you encourage them to engage? What should we do as we leave here today to advance environmental justice and equity?
I would say anybody in academia that has students looking for internship opportunities, who are interested in working in any field involving the environment, encourage them to seek out disadvantaged communities and work on the ground in those communities. Because so often things that we take for granted, things like how to open a document, make some changes and save it under a different name, is something that a lot of the groups I'm working with, I can't teach them how to do that. I've tried. And so very small things that we take for granted are very difficult in some communities, which just puts them at a higher disadvantage for trying to move forward. So I would say if we're able to get students into those communities to try and be the on-the-ground tech support to help these communities have access to some the information that's out there, and also help them be able to document what they're going through. Things like helping them understand how to take pictures and upload them into a folder that they can then share those pictures with other people and share their stories. But that involves a lot of on-the-time, in-person commitment that is really lacking in these communities. And I think internships in college or grad school would be a great, or even high school would be a great tool that could really benefit these communities and help give them the power to be able to connect to some of the resources that are being designed for them.
I think one suggestion that I would make, and again, because I'm so focused on these negotiations that are going on, one of some of these phrases that we hear that are taking off in 2020 and 2021 around climate mitigation and adaptation are net zero, carbon neutral, right? And I think that if I could ask, people to do one thing, it's to be very critical and to do your own research and be an informed consumer, so that when you click to purchase an offset, understand that an offset is not a reduction, right? That there is some community that is going to have to absorb the negative externality of your airplane flight or your SUV or your air conditioner or whatever it is that you're purchasing an offset for. So to be really critical when you see a link for an offset or for something that's advertised as being green and carbon friendly, there's normally some fine print. Click on that, find out who's offering it and why. Where does it go? Where does the money go? Who does it serve, right? And so I think that a lot of times the things that we can do that best support justice is to ask critical questions. And so I think that that's to add to what Jenny was saying is another tip that I would give.
Yeah, so I'm very glad Shannon mentioned net zero pledges, because what I was going to point out was that, we have a lot of employers right now, or large companies rather, that have made pledges around, net zero or going totally climate neutral or reducing emissions. And I'd say that, if your employer is one of these people, you definitely want to hold them accountable to that. And also, hold them accountable to going beyond just, beyond just a very fuzzy net zero pledge, which in practice can mean just purchasing a bunch of offsets that aren't critically monitored, right? And pushing them towards, totally decarbonizing operations, figuring out a way to decarbonize scope 3 emissions in their supply chains, etc. If your employer isn't someone who's made a pledge, well, try to get them to make one of those pledges and start decarbonizing. And then beyond that, on the on the government and advocacy side, right? I mean, everybody here is probably part of a community where you're going to vote for local and state representatives. You basically want to start putting pressure on them to think about climate adaptation and resilience, and think about it in a way that doesn't throw the most vulnerable populations that are under the bus. And that could mean making sure that benefits go to all communities. It could mean making sure that infrastructure doesn't use something like eminent domain to displace a group of people, or it could mean a system of, say, tax credits or grants that can actually go towards community leaders or nonprofits on the ground that are doing that kind of work. So I'd say those are 2-3 things you can do. And then if you're looking to work in this space yourself and educate yourself on, okay, what are the best ways in which I can make an impact personally. I'm just going to plug a company I'm consulting for that creates content specifically for this, called Terra.do. So that's one area, but do your own research and learn about the history of the environmental justice movement and kind of where it's come from and what that means for the future.
I almost got through the whole panel without having a mute snafu, but just want to switch gears here and start taking some questions from the audience. We have a few interesting ones, and just for the audience's references, some of them have already been answered live in the chat, but I'm going to start with this really interesting one. And this is an open question, so feel free to jump in and answer it from any of you three. But Brent is asking, how do you all believe we can begin to address emerging concerns around socioeconomic biases in data and AI, particularly within the environmental health, justice, earth systems, observation, AI domain? Arnav, this kind of feels like it's up your alley.
Yeah, though I'm the slightly less technical co-founder, but yeah, no, I think it's a really important question, and we've seen like AI in criminal justice, for example, it shows some really like horrible biases in the in its output. So I think the first thing to remember is that AI at the end of the day isn't a like some kind of silver bullet or some kind of piece of magic, right? It's a tool. It's a statistical tool, if you want to be very blunt about it. And it depends a lot on like how you interpret the results of your data, what kind of training data set you deploy in the first place. And a lot of that, in practice, what a lot of that comes down to is the discretion of the person deploying that tool for that specific problem. So I do think that it starts with basically having engineers or researchers actually systematically think about this, because for a long time thinking about biases within AI or socioeconomic or racial biases in the kind of data sets was just simply not a thing. And beyond that, I believe there are ways in which you can start actually building better algorithms to ensure that, okay, whatever data set you use is corrected for bias, or that you can like identify the bias in the first place. But since AI at the end of the day is still a tool, it depends. It basically comes down to the engineer working with it to deploy it to proactively look for those kinds of biases in the data set. So sorry, I couldn't give a more specific answer over there. I think if you want something super specific, it would get down to the specific use case and problem. But I'd say generally speaking, you want to make sure that anybody who's using AI for a specific problem is very aware and very attuned to the fact that you will have some biases due to your training data set and due to your own biases as a human being.
Awesome. So the next question is from Sharish. It says, as a follow-up on making climate change a priority, I think what he's asking is how do we make climate change a priority, not just for the government, but also for private funding sources and investors, particularly in the areas of ocean resources and its issues with pollution, noise, acidification, and so on.
This is actually an assignment I give my students some semesters, where I ask them, I'll put up different stakeholders. So for example, and sometimes they're fictional. So we've done, how would you get, this is from the Lego movie, the evil Lord business from the Lego movie, to care about climate change, right? Or how would you, if you were speaking to a neoconservative in the US, how would you convince them that climate change was a priority? And so as much as I would like to believe in my idealistic way of looking at the world, that people genuinely care about the plight of others and about, as Jenny mentioned, the polar bears and other things. I think one thing we've seen is that unfortunately, some of those emotional appeals and the scientific appeal has not worked in the context of the United States. And so one thing that movements have been doing lately is really trying to figure out how it is to make that climate connection, no matter where you are situated within society. And so I think thinking strategically about these things are important. So if you have to make the case to a conservative government, climate change is a national security issue, right? So look at where are our military bases located. They're mostly coastal cities, right? Look at how much we are using to deploy our military for natural disasters as opposed to military interventions. If you're speaking to someone in business thinking about maybe you have to switch tacks and talk about the fact that fossil fuels are not a renewable resource. So whether you care about climate change or not, we're going to have to find something else. To me, it breaks my heart to have to make those arguments, but I think we're at the point where the IPCC and the UN are indicating that we've only got 10 years left, as you mentioned in the beginning. We need to start thinking strategically about how to make that argument to different stakeholders where climate change wouldn't necessarily rise to the top of their priority list.
And shifting off of some of the fossil fuels that are the most damaging, of every state in the United States, California's oil and gas has the highest greenhouse gas contribution. It is the dirtiest, the most degraded, and uses the most energy and the most water to drill. So of any state in the United States, the first state that should stop drilling is California. And one of the #1 exports out of California is petroleum coke, which is illegal to use as an energy source here because it's so much dirtier than coal. So even as we divest from fossil fuels, we need to stop drilling the dirtiest oils first. I mean, one of the California fields is second only to the Canadian tar sands in terms of its greenhouse gas contributions. So that's an eye-opening thing that we need to really be paying attention to.
Awesome. And this will probably be the last question we take today, but Brent's previous question was more of a two-part question. The second part to the bias question is who decides or who accepts where air quality monitoring occurs? How do we address the biases that miss different communities' perceptions of adaptation solutions like greening?
So there's lots of answers to that question. For the government level regulatory stations, it's very challenging for them to find locations where they get approval to actually put in the equipment. And not all regulatory stations monitor all of the same components to air quality. So it's also difficult trying to figure out which ones are doing ozone, which ones are doing fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. And so even then, there's very few of them and they aren't measuring everything. My organization has an air quality monitoring network where we deploy low-cost consumer level air quality monitors. We only deploy them in gap areas. So we'll pull up a map to see where there's little to no air quality monitors, and we will send them to those areas. One of the problems we're frequently running into is one of the most accurate low-cost sensors it's by Purple Air. It's the Purple Air PA2. It requires Wi-Fi and an outdoor outlet. And so a lot of the communities that have no local air quality monitoring, it is extremely difficult to find places that have access to an outdoor outlet. And I've had projects where we'll get a monitor into somebody's home, and the only reason they had Wi-Fi was their grandson was living with them. And 2 months later, he moved out and the Wi-Fi is gone. So that monitor's offline. And so trying to find ways to keep them online is difficult. But then it becomes even more complicated because some of the most harmful particulate matter that people are exposed to is ultrafine particulate matter. And that's not federally regulated. And there aren't low-cost sensors that can accurately detect it. So things like diesel emissions show up in the ultrafine section. Roughly 90% of the particulate matter we breathe is ultrafine. And it is so small that it makes it into our bloodstream and can cause health impacts throughout our whole body. But even when you can get money for the expensive equipment needed to detect it, it's not federally regulated. And so we can't even make recommendations based on that data. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of really looking at the most harmful things people are being exposed to and finding ways to not only have equipment that accurately detects it in the places where we need to be focusing on, but having it federally regulated so that we can have actions to take when we get that data. Oh, and somebody shared our website. Yes, you can learn all about this at Coalition for Clean Air's website.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. This has been time flies. I know that we probably could have discussed about these various topics for hours, but thank you three so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk with us today. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. I hope everybody took something important away from today or felt like they learned something new. I know I definitely did. And thanks again to the AI LA team for hosting us today.